Well, welcome back, everybody. It's the holiday season, and a lot of us are going to be spending time with our family members, extended family, particularly parents and grandparents, people who are getting older. And when we're spending time with these individuals, you might notice some things about them. Might be a little bit more forgetful than last time you saw them. They might be misplacing things, kind of scatterbrained. They also might have personality changes. They might seem more irritable and more stubborn and more kind of snippy and stuff. So, John, when I mention all of these traits, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you?
My family, like my whole family, my own attitude with my family. But we're talking about aging people, right? We're talking about people in a family that's getting older and just how that can be challenging in a lot of ways. I mean, it's easy to think that could be dementia, right?
Yeah. Well, dementia, John, you could be a doctor because that is the first thing that a lot of geriatric doctors are going to assume. But what if I told you, particularly for us and our listeners, there's a really good chance that it is not dementia?
Yeah, so a lot of these traits sound familiar in other ways. If not dementia, I'm thinking ADHD, autism, right? It's a genetic
Title of our
component.
podcast, it's just ADHD.
Yeah. Especially with that genetic component, right? So if we're feeling it and we're in places with our families, especially the older generations that might not be as aware or have diagnosed, or maybe, in some families, circumstances might have turned to alcoholism as a way to cope, could bring out a whole slew of different issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a rampant jaw-dropping issue with misdiagnosis, particularly just assuming that everybody who has these traits that's older has dementia. And so we're going to get into that in this episode because I think it's a really important thing to keep in the back of your mind as you're seeing these family members, for you to not jump to assuming that it's dementia either, because it can have some very profound consequences if you do get misdiagnosed. So let's get into it. So before we begin, I just want to remind you that this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. It is not intended to replace professional medical care. We are not doctors. We don't claim to be. We are just a couple of nerds who find this information and this research really fascinating, and we want to discuss it, but please keep your medical decisions between you and your doctor and keep us out of it. All right, let's begin. And we'll jump over to autism briefly. And I do say briefly because there's not a lot of research, as per usual. I feel like every episode on this show, we're like, oh, there's this issue with ADHD, but don't worry, there's really good researchers they're on it, they're working on it. We have Russell Barkley and we have good people working on the ADHD stuff. And then autism, it's just like all a bummer. This episode is no different. Research on older autistic adults makes up 0.4% of all studies on autism. 0.4%. So, there wasn't a whole lot to say about autism. I really did my best to find info, and we have a little bit, but there's not a ton.
And I know you searched for it too. It's just we come across this a lot where it's like there isn't a lot of research, and the research that's done is like it's always from the like we're gonna get them, we're gonna get them perspective, right? Where it's like what's wrong with these? Yeah, it's like what's wrong with these weirdos? It's never from like the let's find things that help and understand how the traits that can bring positivity to our culture and environment. And
interestingly, while I was trying to research for this episode, what I did find a lot of info on is caregivers of highly impaired autistic adults who are concerned about what's going to happen when they become old, how their child is going to receive care. So there's like more info out there for like caregivers than for like autistic adults themselves, it seems. But we know a little bit. I can summarize the 0.4% for you guys. So and part of the reason here, part of the issue is that autism was like quote unquote discovered a lot earlier, like in the 40s, but it wasn't widely recognized until the 70s. So when you think about the first wave of people diagnosed, they're not even 65 yet. And those who did get diagnosed are gonna tend to skew more towards people where it was like really, really obvious that they're autistic, right? It's going to be a lower masking population, level 2 and level 3 support needs. They might have comorbid intellectual disabilities, stuff like that. So the research, as a consequence, is also going to kind of skew in that direction because they did it on the people who were able to receive a diagnosis in 1980. And that's obviously not super inclusive of like all of the diversity of autistic people today under the current diagnostic criteria.
Right.
But there was a meta-analysis from 2024 that looked at longitudinal outcomes of autistic people. So basically over the lifespan of autistic people, what's going to happen to us. And they were focused on this metric that's called successful aging. So this goes a little bit further than just looking at like raw life expectancy. It looks at like quality of life, right? Are you aging well? Kind of in the name, successful aging. And it's a standardized metric actually that's used a lot in elder care, and they evaluate 4 main factors. So the first one is basically, are you healthy and able to participate in the daily activities that you care about? The second one is basically, do you have like physical or cognitive impairments? The third one is your mood and whether you're feeling generally happy, fulfilled, satisfied with life. Like they call it your affect. The fourth factor is whether you have a social life and you're like involved in your community or whether you're isolated. So this one was fun. Only 3.3% of autistic adults age 40 or older met the criteria of successful aging. So 97% of us are aging unsuccessfully and don't have high scores in all 4 of those pillars.
Um, this is something I worry about. Like, it's something I think about a lot, right? Because it's like it's hard to find examples of people aging well to begin with. I think particularly for a lot of reasons. I think particularly just the media portrayal, right? When you think about the way the media portrays aging, it's
It's
rarely
something
like
to avoid. It's
or be
it's something to
afraid
be
of, right?
scared of. Yeah.
There's so much like, the market of like staying young and beauty and all of that. And it's hard to find good examples of people aging well on one side of it. And then like, especially like what we're saying about having ADHD or autism, it's like, it's hard to find examples of that to begin with. And then aging well in that category is tough.
Yeah. And guys, I'm super sorry, but this is the reality of it, right? Like there are very meaningful barriers for us that I think are very underrepresented and not understood by the geriatric medical community. And part of that is obviously the lack of research, right? Like 0.4%. Come on.
Well, and the medical community part of that too, right? I think just because of the way our healthcare is in America, at least the United States, uh, it's tough because as you get older, you end up with more chronic conditions and you end up needing more healthcare support. But our healthcare is not good, and so people end up in situations where they are not aging great because they're not getting the care that they need.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, so a lot of this was kind of predictable for why we would score so low. So, John, can you guess for the first metric, that one about whether you're kind of healthy and able to participate in daily activities? What do you think would be barriers to that for autistic people?
Oh man. Well, for healthy living, I mean, like we were saying a second ago, like access to healthcare is one, right? The
Right.
levels of adaptive skills, right? Um, comes up. God, what you have a whole
Yeah, it's
chart.
like your ability to mask, right? Like that. And that's very much a thing with older autistic adults. Their energy levels drop, and so it gets a lot harder to mask
Yeah,
and adapt.
I'm just thinking about, like, all the old the grumpy grandparents who just, like, the social filter is gone at a certain point, right? It's just like,
Yeah,
yeah, say whatever's in your mind. Cool.
yeah. Very autistic of them. One of the interesting things about this study too, the longitudinal one, so that it's a meta-analysis. They were trying to aggregate as much info as they possibly could to try and paint some sort of picture. It's a very recent one from 2024 as well. And in the study, like, the authors are kind of funny in, like, a morbid way, like, not like haha funny, but, like, when they would describe the results of these meta-analyses, they would be like, "But also there's this huge gap here and this huge gap here." Like, you could tell that the researchers were, like, really unhappy with the state of research today, so they just, like, kept throwing in these little quips. It's a very, very long document, but they're just like, this study has all these limitations, we can't really
Wow.
conclude a lot from it, but they did their best. I appreciate them.
Cool. So I found the chart here that's got the aging graphic.
Yeah, so for that first metric as well, there's definitely just, like, it's our comorbidities that also prevent us from participating in daily living, right? Like, it's, gastrointestinal conditions, epilepsy,
Mm,
metabolic conditions, yeah, hearing and vision problems, stuff like that. Like, that's, it's gonna make it harder to, like, go out and do things, right? It's hard. So for the second one, the cognitive and physical impairment, what do you think are gonna be the blockers for autistic people?
looks like a lot of cognitive decline, right? Early onset Parkinson's disease comes up. Uh, autistic trait. What's asterisk? Autistic traits related to cognitive decline.
Yeah, so both autism and ADHD put you, unfortunately, at a higher risk of developing dementia
Wow.
and other conditions that would be related to cognitive decline.
Low quality of life associated with poor mental health. More autistic traits, stress, and social
Yeah.
support.
That one's the for the positive affect, vector, that which is basically, do you feel happy? Do you feel fulfilled? Guess what? We were depressed when we're younger, and we're depressed when we're older.
Yeah, so that one isn't going to go away. Increased prevalence of anxiety, depression. But the symptoms may reduce with age. Interesting.
I think at some point you stop giving a fuck.
Yeah, sounds about right.
But yeah, certainly the stress is a big factor for autistic folks. And then the last one is social participation engagement. This one's obvious. If I had to guess, I think that's probably one of the biggest factors on why we score so low, but,
Yeah, yeah. And this one, like the high loneliness, community participation. This one, I mean, this is true for any demographic where we know that being around a community, being around others makes such a big impact on your overall well-being and mental health and how you age. This is where I think, especially as you're talking about the study, like, and it being done on people with higher support needs, right? People with higher support needs are going to have much, much greater barriers of access to social support. Social support.
I think this this meta-analysis is obviously sad and kinda scary, but I think the silver lining that I took away from this is sort of that it's predictable and expected, right? Like, w we're impaired by comorbid conditions that we largely have when we're younger as well. There is somewhat of an increased risk of cognitive decline, but it's not huge. We already are depressed, so kind of to be expected that you would continue to have anxiety and depression. It might even get better when you get older. And certainly social isolation, it's again to be expected. So in a way, it made me feel a little better from the standpoint that it's like the devil, if that makes sense. Like, It's the same factors that I think a lot of us deal with now. It's just it has sort of a compounding effect when you're older, but I also think that that gives us a little bit of agency, to at least address some of those, right? Like to actively work on like the social isolation piece in particular.
Yeah. Well, it's like the more foundations we can set up while we're young, the better we can help our aging process. It makes a lot of
And we'll share some tips at the end as well for, you know, because I know a lot of us, most of us, statistics would say, feel isolation now. But there are specific things you can do to reduce isolation when you are older. And so we'll share some tips on that at the end. That like even if you don't have a strong social net right now, that doesn't mean that you're like screwed forever.
yeah. And the other thing too that we know helps is movement, right? And activity. And that's going to be harder the older you get and uh the more you end up with mobility issues. So, I don't know, this is, it's one thing to think about how we're going to age and how we can like we're lucky enough to live in an age where we have a little bit more research. We can start to think about how it will affect us. But when we're at those family gatherings and we're dealing with the people in our family who did not have access to these resources, or they're the ones that are like suffering from it now, how do we support them? What do we?
Yeah, so I think for particularly if there's other stuff for ADHD adults that we can get into in a minute here because we'll talk about more of the ADHD research. For autistic adults, I think really just trying to go after the social isolation piece. So spending time with them alone is helpful, right? Some of the other things that researchers recommended, and this is true for both ADHD and autism, was like retirement communities are actually a really good thing because it gives you sort of a built-in social net. They found that suburbs are not so good for aging with ADHD and autism
Yeah,
because particularly American suburbs, I don't think that this is quite as true with European suburbs, but American suburbs, you're very isolated. You're far away from storefronts. It's harder to get to stores. It's harder to get to activities. They also, you have to rethink your approach to social activities. If you leave it up to the person with ADHD or autism to schedule social events, they're not going to do it. And so, kind of creating structure for your family member to where they can just go show up at a class, go show up at a volunteer activity. That's again the beauty of these retirement communities is
yeah,
there's someone externally organizing it that is goes a long way so that they just have to show up week after week and have contact with people.
yeah.
So
We were
just
talking.
helping them have structure around social outings.
Yeah, uh, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like those are great ways to help out. But thinking about what we were talking about a minute ago of good examples of aging well and how it's depicted in the media. Have you seen the show Man on the Inside?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I love that series because it's like that's one of the few shows where like you have people who are aging well and thriving. It makes it look fun, and I'm like, oh, this is cool because here's a show of people getting older and like and living in their life. And it's not it's not made out to be scary. So that's really thought that was a really it's a fun show.
So, you wanna talk about ADHD now?
Yeah, let's get into it.
And dementia in particular. The big scary thing here, I would say, is getting misdiagnosed with dementia. And there's this huge problem of if you weren't diagnosed with ADHD or autism earlier in life, it can be even harder to diagnose it when you are like 65 and older. And it's often mistaken for mild cognitive decline or other neurodegenerative conditions. So, and that's not to say that you couldn't have both. That is certainly confounding variable in the diagnosis is that you could have both. And both conditions give you an increased risk. Certainly autism does. ADHD, a very large study from 2023 showed that 13 of people with ADHD developed dementia compared to the 7% of the general population. But good news for ADHDers, if you consistently take stimulants, that doubled risk factor completely goes away. And you only have the same risk as the general population. So, stimulants, friends, those can help.
Super interesting. Yeah, it definitely explains why the cafes and coffee shops are frequented by um, the aging population, right? You see them drinking coffee all day long, and totally makes sense.
There's obviously not enough research yet to establish a causal relationship, meaning like we can't say for certain that these stimulants led to a decreased risk of dementia, but there was certainly a very obvious correlation, and it very much went against what the researchers hypothesized. They thought that, you know, if you had ADHD severe enough to where you got prescribed stimulants, because generally people who get stimulants have more severe ADHD, that they would have an increased risk of dementia. So it was almost inverted. And so that's where they were like, okay, we really, and again, this is a study from 2023. So jury's still out here, but they were like, we really need to look into more of whether there is a causal relationship where the stimulants are essentially strengthening the pathways. And this would be my hypothesis too. If the stimulants are strengthening the pathways, then it's kind of a buffer against neurodegenerative diseases. The good news is regardless, they said the stimulants showed no correlation with an increased risk of developing dementia. So we can say with a fair amount of confidence that it's not going to hurt on the dementia front.
Right. That's good. That's good. I can definitely see how it could look like ADHD can look like dementia, especially with the forgetfulness, right? A lot of these symptoms, like just the repeating yourself or forgetting things mid conversation, right? Especially as you're older, like that's got it. That I've seen this happen. Like when where my grandmother would tell a story and then like a couple minutes later tell the same story, and it's like, is that dementia? But it was probably just ADHD, right? It's
I
that
think so.
because she didn't have other dementia traits. Do So it definitely makes sense why ADHD can look like dementia. What else could it look like?
It could be a lot of things. Like, if you have someone who you suspect has dementia, it's so important to get them screened for all these other things. So, a really big one is medication side effects. Older people are often on multiple medications, and so that has the risk of both each individual medication causing dementia-like symptoms, and it is way more common than you would think, and also interactions with each other. The more meds you add into the cocktail, the higher risk that two of them will kind of compound and cause dementia-like traits. So definitely make sure that it's not just a medication side effect, right? Another big one is vitamin deficiency, like B1 and B12 are big ones that would make you kind of seem like you have dementia. And this is especially acute for autistic populations, right? Because we tend to have restrictive eating. We, especially in older age, fall back to like safe foods. And so we might have vitamin deficiencies. There's also the risk of thyroid disorders. Those can look like dementia. This one's crazy. Infections like upper respiratory infection or a UTI. Like, no joke, a UTI can cause dementia-like symptoms in the older population. So screen for that because that's, scary and painful. Or liver failure. And again, this one was also really scary. A study found that 13% of presumed dementia patients actually had liver failure, which is very treatable and obviously requires a very different treatment path than dementia medication. Now, they're not saying that they necessarily only had liver failure and not dementia. Some percentage of that 13% could have had both. But what they can, without a doubt, conclude from this study is that they certainly had liver failure and it was either causing or exacerbating their mental capability issues. So screen for liver failure, you guys.
Yeah, that one stands out to me. Just as we were talking about the older generation not having access to diagnosis or support or medication will turn to alcohol. And I'm just thinking about like people in my family who've turned to alcohol and because it's as a way to self-medicate. And that's a whole that has a whole range of issues, but that's going to cause liver failure. So now that's something else to look out for.
People with ADHD, we smoke, we drink, we are way more likely to get addicted to this stuff. But again, stimulants do lower that risk. But yeah, these lifetime choices can compound and really raise your risk of liver failure. And again, that looks like dementia and it's getting missed all the time because they're not screening for it. So do your due diligence if you have a older family member. But beyond that, ADHD is getting missed. So, studies have also shown only 20% of memory care clinics even screen for ADHD. And that small fraction, the ones that do, typically just ask you to recall ADHD traits in your childhood. But most people at age 65 or up are going to be unreliable narrators about our childhood. So, studies show that different studies or like so deeply layered, like study within study within study at this point. But other studies show that people with ADHD have very poor autobiographical memory, meaning we have a lot of trouble remembering past events in our lives. So when they look at us compared to neurotypicals, we score the same on our ability to encode memories. So like to form memories in the first place, we're fine. We can learn new material the same as neurotypicals. And we have perfectly fine memory recall and retrieving information, right? Like we're all kind of little encyclopedias about our special interests. We can pull up facts just fine. But where we show deficits are it's in something called source discrimination, which means we're less able to describe when and where an event happened to us and the surrounding context of those memories. So to understand this, kind of think about Instagram, right? When people are uploading images to Instagram, you use tags like the hashtags on your photos, and that makes it really easy for other people to search for something specific, right? Because the photo is tagged. And so when they search, you can show a whole big library of all these images that have that tag, right? But for us, our memories are not adding a location tag and they're not adding a timestamp. So it makes it a lot harder to search and find what you're looking for. And you might, if you find this memory, you're like, wait, where did this come from? When did this happen? What is this? So basically, we are not properly tagging our memories when we're storing them. Memories specifically about ourselves. We are fine with storing facts about other things, but about our own lives, we do have deficits in recalling our own lives.
Yeah, that happens to me now.
And by the way, that's not an age-related one. That's like for your whole life with ADHD.
Totally right. Yeah, because the inability to perceive time, right? It's a whole time blindness thing because I can't perceive time. I never know how long things take, and we always often conflate time with emotions. That's why it's hard to estimate how long things could take. But even at a larger scale, like I'm at a point where I don't know how long ago something was, or I'm remembering an event emotionally, like feel like it was just yesterday. It's like it's crazy how that happens, and
Memories
so
don't have a timestamp.
totally, yeah, yeah. So it's already happening, and I can only imagine, and I can, it's very predictable that will continue to happen, and is happening in older people, which makes them unreliable historians.
Right. And so it's deeply problematic that, again, only 20% of clinics are even screening for ADHD. And those ones are asking you to recall events from your childhood. Like, this is a horrible way to screen for ADHD. This is a horrible way. So sometimes what they'll do is bring in family members to help with screenings. It helps just to have, even if it's your spouse, your kids, whatever, someone who can sort of attest, like, no, these things did not just crop up. She has always lost her keys, or, because we're like, I have never, I never used to lose my keys. Actually, you
Yeah.
did. The outside historians can be very helpful for determining that.
Yeah, so given that, what what's happening when people are getting misdiagnosed?
Yeah, it's not good. It's not like a benign thing. Dementia medications have quite a few side effects, and when you read about it, you're not gonna see that reflected in a lot of the literature. The reason for that, so I found this other study where it's asking pharmacists and caregivers about adverse side effects to the most common dementia medications. I'm just quoting the study directly here. Most of the anti-dementia drug epidemiology research that has been published has been conducted with funding from drug companies selling anti-dementia drugs and show low rates for adverse event prevalence. So basically, the manufacturers are the ones funding the studies, and they're like, "Ah, there's hardly any side effects. This is great." And so, what this study in particular did, they decided to talk to the people who are closer to the patients and actually witnessing potential side effects. And it was a very large study, a lot of participants. So, this is a pretty good one. And so they're looking at mainly two most common types of dementia medications, acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, which is basically inhibiting acetylcholine reuptake, and NMDA receptor antagonists. So the study found that 21% of patients experience adverse effects from dementia medication. This is a lot higher than what you're going to see if you go to like, you know, your typical like generic website that's looking at like the side effect rates. So yeah, 21% have side effects, and they also found when they looked at the study participants, there was kind of a small group of people that they were like, actually, they shouldn't have gotten dementia medications. These were prescribed inappropriately. They probably didn't have dementia, and in that group of people. The side effect rate was 38%. So, in other words, if you take dementia medication and you don't actually have dementia, based on this study, your side effect rate might be double. Okay, so, um, not good. And then the types of side effects are also not good. So of the people who experienced side effects, 45% had kind of mental overstimulation or insomnia or like uncontrollable movements, like just kind of all these things in the like mega jitters category, right? They think part of that might be that the dosage was too high. It's almost like if you take too much of a stimulant, right? It's kind of a similar thing. You're going to get like insomnia and jittery and stuff. 34% had nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea, like generally, gastrointestinal problems. This is the scary part. 21% had hallucinations or delusions,
Wow.
and 16% had violent behavior caused by the medications. So
Wow.
these are not things to take lightly. Um, and to kind of compound this, um, dementia patients can also become very aggressive and agitated. And in those cases, they will sometimes be prescribed antipsychotic drugs in addition to dementia drugs. And ironically, the dementia drugs could actually be the cause of the violent behavior. So you're adding on like another med to like compensate for it. This practice is somewhat controversial, but it's also not uncommon because you're effectively sedating people to make them more compliant and easier to deal with. And there's kind of evidence that suggests that this happens more frequently in like nursing homes where they're understaffed or the staff isn't properly trained and the dementia patients are kind of acting up and they need to like sedate them, right? So these antipsychotic drugs have worse side effects. They include stroke, blood clot, heart attack, heart failure, pneumonia, and acute kidney injury. So not good. That also freaks me out because when we think about an older autistic person, they might go nonverbal or appear aggressive or agitated not because of dementia or not exclusively because of dementia. It might be because they become overstimulated and overwhelmed, and their ability to mask and cope is just kind of shot when they're older. So, in that case, the treatment is obviously not antipsychotic drugs. It would be decreasing sensory load, removing them from the situation, helping them to calm down, helping them to stim, right?
Yeah.
And so, if they get misdiagnosed as being like agitated, non-compliant dementia patients, they're going to get thrown on number one, dementia drugs, number two, antipsychotic drugs with some potentially fatal side effects.
Yeah, that's alarming. And I think the thing is this if you're taking the wrong medication at all, it's gonna be bad, right? And this is if people I think this is why it's important to get the diagnosis right because dementia's a real thing, it's a real problem, and it needs to be treated when it's dementia. But if you're treating not dementia and you're giving people the wrong thing, then these side effects are going to create a lot of issues that can otherwise be
Yeah.
avoided,
Yeah.
right?
And again, it's just like, why are they not screening for these things? There's actually not a test that exists to screen for this stuff appropriately today. Researchers like Kathleen Nadeau, who I don't know if it's Nadeau or Nadeau, who I referenced pretty heavily in this video. She's working on it. Other people are working on it, but as of today, there's just not like an appropriate assessment that's tailored based on your age. And also, just want to throw in newer dementia drugs are even worse. It's not like it's getting better. So they have a new class of dementia drugs called anti-amyloid monoclonal antibodies. The idea is that it's more preventative approach. So the acetylcholinease drugs that I was talking about earlier can help a lot in the early stages of dementia, but they kind of hit a point where they stop helping when dementia gets worse. So it's helpful to take it early. That's part of why they're very aggressive with screening. Makes sense. But you just kind of hit a point where it doesn't help anymore. These new ones, in theory, are supposed to kind of help stave off dementia throughout the trajectory, but they're actually finding pretty severe side effects for some people, including brain bleeding and death. They were accepted in most countries, but the European Medicines Agency has rejected them, has banned them. There are genetic risk factors that can make you more prone to brain bleeding. So certainly if you have a family member going on these drugs, make sure that they do the genetic screening to make sure it's an appropriate choice for their genetic makeup. But again, that can kill you, and it's a real shame if you didn't actually have dementia in the first place.
For people that have dementia, do you have a sense for how effective these medications actually are when used appropriately?
I didn't do a ton of research into dementia, right? Because that's not the focus of this channel. I think they are effective, and I think part of why, doctors are kind of aggressive with this stuff is because it really does help to start early, to start your treatment early. That's gonna really extend, quality life. I don't know if it impacts life expectancy, but certainly, your sort of salient, happy part of your life where you can, like, still remember things. But it's not a I wouldn't say it's a solved problem, right? Because of these side effects are a lot, and they can really particularly some of the stuff where it's like it can hurt your kidneys or liver. That's already an issue with older people, and so it can really exacerbate pre-existing conditions and stuff.
Yeah. So I guess if you have a loved one then that looks like they're going through this, then this is why it's so important to make sure you can help them navigate this, right? And get the appropriate diagnosis so that they can get the treatment that makes the most sense. Because if it's not dementia, it is ADHD or autism, there are other things we can do that will likely be more effective.
With way less side effects, yeah.
So since there's so much overlap and obviously ADHD can look like dementia, how do you start to distinguish them? How can you help your navigate this with your family members? And what does dementia look like that's different from
Yeah.
ADHD?
This one is hard. When I first started looking into it, you look at these, like, Venn diagram charts, and I'm looking at, the dementia side and the ADHD side, and I'm like, "It's the same thing." But there are differences, right? What Kathleen Nadeau had said is ADHD is like a Swiss cheese memory. So you're going to forget random things intermittently, but they also come back. There's kind of this element of being disorganized, like scatterbrain, stuff like that. That's just ADHD. Dementia looks more like a global onset where specifically short term memories are forgotten. And I think, those of us that have been around people with dementia, their long-term memory tends to stay intact, and in fact, they will sometimes have, like, a memory dump of, like, long-term memories, like, they'll remember their childhood in vivid detail, but they can't remember eating breakfast this morning, right? So, dementia is gonna look more like a blanket loss of short-term memory altogether. So that's one that's probably the most clear-cut difference in my opinion. And then the other thing is you're still gonna have classic ADHD traits, and part of the problem is it can look like sudden onset, like, "I didn't have these issues before," but really what it is you had ADHD your whole life, but you masked and you coped, but now you don't have the energy to cope. Demands have exceeded your capacity and now everything is falling apart, right? So now it's like, I was never this scatterbrained. I was never, this disorganized. You kind of were actually like under the hood. So you're still gonna have misplaced items, unfinished project, time management issues, distractibility. ADHD is gonna have more emotional symptoms than early onset dementia. I know we talked about agitation in dementia patients. That tends to be later on. By the way, I'm using the term dementia. There's actually, mild cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's. There's a bunch of different types. I'm kind of using this term interchangeably, but just want to note that there are a number of different types with their own nuance, but kind of for the purposes of this episode, that doesn't super matter. Anyway, so ADHD is going to have more emotional symptoms than those early onset versions. It can look like anxiety, being easily frustrated, irritability, sadness and regret over your life, impatience, or increased inflexibility. And women in particular, I thought this was interesting, tend to have like worsening self esteem and feel like they talk too much in social situations. They'll ruminate on interactions and stuff like that.
Yeah,
That
it's all very relatable. Even now. Sort of when you talk about it, right? Like I think because the ADHD symptoms can be similar. The point you made earlier around like you forget things but they come back, right? You're generally disorganized, but you can push through it. It's just your ability to mask, maintain, stay on top of it might be a little bit harder. And I think like things I've observed with dementia, I haven't had a lot of experience with dementia, but sometimes I think like with ADHD, it's forgetting where things are. But then with dementia, is it fair to say like it's forgetting maybe when things are, right? Because you say like having this vivid childhood memories and kind of like going back or forgetting people or when things happen entirely.
Yeah, and like I think forgetting like chunks of your day and stuff like that. Forgetting we went to the mall yesterday. Like it's like we have that now too. So that's where it's tricky. Honestly, like if you can get your family member into one of the few clinics that actually does have awareness of ADHD, I think that goes a long way because it's can be such a subtle line um that it's hard and maybe the more of the, like, silver bullet, if you could call it that, is looking at whether you have this other clustering of symptoms, right? Hyperactivity is still a thing too, right? But it's not gonna look like you're not gonna have, like, 80-year-olds, like, sprinting laps, really. It's gonna look more like, again, racing thoughts, taking on too many projects, talking too much, struggling to relax because you feel like you constantly have to do things. Uh, so I think if you're having memory issues and an absence of all of these other traits, maybe that's a better way to like think of dementia because certainly our memories are not perfect either, especially our
Yeah.
autobiographical memories, as we learned.
Yeah. Right. And so I think that's a good thing to look at then. It's like the other ADHD traits, which is why the ADHD diagnosis is so important because ADHD is so treatable and the treatment's going to be so radically different than a dementia treatment.
Yeah, and then for both, I heard this in kind of researching both sides, but certainly for autism, social isolation tends to become a lot more acute with age. Part of that is natural life progression, right? Like retiring from work, retiring to like a home in the suburbs, stuff like that, and a decreased ability to mask because you just simply do not have the energy to do it anymore. And so that's where it can sometimes look like a personality shift in
Mm,
a loved one, that they are getting more rigid, getting more snippy and stuff, but it's actually just they're masking less. They kinda always had it in them, but they were masking it all these years, and now they can't
I'm
do
not
it
trying to
any
get along, not trying to get along anymore,
right?
right? Not trying to play nice. It's like
And lack of structure after you, particularly after you like retire, can really worsen this. So, for example, staying up really late because you don't have work tomorrow, and like that, it can just make everything a lot more compounded. You also don't have a source of like low effort, regularly scheduled social interaction with other human beings by like going into the office, right? And then again, because older autistic adults tend to lose their ability to mask, it can really exacerbate the social isolation on top of a lifetime of challenges of like making friends and building community to begin with. And I don't want to gloss over this one. Social isolation is like a really big deal, like a really freaking big deal. So there was like a recent meta-analysis that looked at your risk factors for developing dementia. Again, not necessarily causal, but maybe risk factors is how they referred to it. But it was a really big meta-analysis. The strongest evidence they found, like the biggest risk factors, were number one, taking benzodiazepines, number two, depression, and number three, social isolation. And so certainly we have the social isolation, which can, be a risk factor for dementia. And that can also contribute to depression, which can be a risk factor for dementia. So it's a really big social isolation plays a really big role in your ability to like age well. There have been additional studies that have found that loneliness is a bigger factor in your physical and mental health compared to conditions like diabetes. So, this is a huge risk factor.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that surprising, but that's like it's also probably one that's I wouldn't say easy to remedy, but there's things we can do about it, right? Especially if we're thinking if we're looking forward, not just at our own lives, but like at our loved ones, right? And we want to help people age well. This is why I think it's so important to call your mom, call your dad, right? It's like the social aspect and the community aspect doesn't always necessarily have to mean like going out making new friends. It's like, and this is why family is so important. That's why we're we're thinking about this at this time of the year, right? Because you're spending time with your families, and it's tough because family can be tough, right? But it's like that community is also so important and such a valuable part of how we support each other and how we age.
Yeah, I think, when you go and see a family member that maybe you don't love being around, keep in mind that that's like medicine for them, right? Like, think of it that way, and that might give you a little
Right.
bit higher tolerance for some of the
Well, it's just empathy. Like, it's a great way to put it.
but I think, like you said, it's kind of a double-sided coin. It's such a big risk factor. It's such a thing that we struggle with, but at the same time, it's one of those things that if you address it, it, like, feels good and there's not gonna be side effects. It's not like taking a medication, right? And so that part gives me hope, and certainly there are structured ways to remedy that. So, just keeping in mind, we do have some amount of agency. Certainly, it's there's that pervasive sense that you are different, but, like, we can work with it, right? But let's talk through a real world example. So, I obviously have family members who are neurodivergent, surprising with the genetics there. So, I had an incident earlier this year where my grandma's sister was temporarily put into a nursing home because she broke her leg, and she was exhibiting signs that, like, even in the nursing home, they chalked it up to dementia or I guess what you would call like early sort of memory loss. But I actually think it was ADHD and autism, and we can talk through why. So,
So this is personal for you. This is
very much so.
I hate
I
close to
think
home.
think it becomes personal for all of us at some point, right? Even if
Yeah,
it's not something you're going through right now, it's probably something that your loved ones will go through at some point. And
highly plausible.
yeah, and you as well. So raise awareness now so that we can
Yeah.
get better help later, right? Because most of our listeners are not age 65 and up. So she was temporarily in a nursing home. She broke her leg raking leaves because she was fixated on whether there's a single leaf in her lawn. And I guess this is like a recurring theme for her. So her son describes it as being OCD, but I really feel like this is autism. So we have a episode as well from one of our first ones distinguishing OCD from ADHD and autism, because again, on the surface, it can, and from an outside perspective, it can look similar, but there are actually some pretty meaningful differences. So just to recap, with OCD, you might feel compelled to like obsessively rake the leaves or else a loved one will die. Like it's because you are trying to avoid dire consequences. The stakes are high. And when you do these sort of obsessive compulsions, it's because you're trying to alleviate the tremendous amount of distress that you're experiencing, even though the action doesn't necessarily follow a logical conclusion, right? Because it's like, how would raking leaves avoid killing someone? But that's actually very classic of OCD. OCD is often not logical at all because they believe at this point in time, they don't know for sure, that it's caused by structural and functional differences in some of the more primitive parts of the brain. And those parts of the brain do not control logic. They are more the like instinctual parts of your brain. And so a lot of people with OCD are consciously aware that it's illogical and they still feel this like overwhelming urge to do it anyway because it is almost more instinct based than like a, you know, if A then B like logical, well thought out thing.
Well, that's why it's a compulsion, right? It's an obsessive compulsion, which is why it's a compulsive disorder. Versus, I think, like the reason I think it feels so similar to people with ADHD is it's very relatable, but it's
Mhm.
relatable because we have impulsivity. So it's like it's like the instinct to act right before thinking things through, and then hyper focus and hyper fixation, right? It's like the idea of like needing to go deep on something or spend a lot of time on something, and it's hard to pull away. So it can feel similar, but I think to your point, it's very different things.
And typically those compulsions are going to be very consistent over time, right? Like you'd be obsessing about raking those leaves every day, whereas someone with ADHD, it's a thought that might happen once or twice. And then, you know, it's not necessarily something that you think about every day. Autism is going to look a little blurrier because we do care about structure. We do have repetition. We will do the same thing every day for our entire lives. So that's the line. I guess I can't know for sure, but with my grandma's sister, from what I have been told, she fixates on having a tidy lawn because she wants her lawn to be tidy. And so that's not really a fear-based thing. That's more of just like an autism drive for order.
Yeah, it's reasonable, right? Also, just good neighbor, right? You want it to be tidy and to be a good member of the community, have a good,
Yeah.
nice lawn.
It's funny, her neighbor is her son, so um the stakes are a little lower, but uh um so she, was raking her lawn, fell, broke her leg. After all this happened, right, they take her to the doctor and they say you have to go into this nursing home while you're healing up. So she calls my mom and she's just so distraught. And I want to be clear, she's a very sweet lady. She's very kind, so generous, like so charitable. Like she's like a second mom basically for everyone in our family. And so she's generally, very grounded, but in this instance she was very emotional. So I don't want to like paint an inaccurate picture of her, but she was like, my son is like dragging me here against my will. This is not fair. I'm going to die here. And so we're like, what's going on? Like what, is he being cruel? And then we talk to him and it turns out she was completely bedridden after breaking her leg. Like she couldn't go to the bathroom by herself. She needed physical therapy. So like of course in that circumstance you do have like, because she was like, why can't you just have someone come into my house? and take care of me, but like you would need someone there 24/7. And so of course, just temporarily she did need to go into like a facility where they had people who can help her go to the bathroom and make sure that she's fed and make sure that she does not fall again and stuff like that. So, but it's a really great example of both, I think, the ADHD emotional reactivity as well as that like justice sensitivity, because she really felt like she was wrong to the extent that she refused to do any sort of rehab exercises just out of protest
Wow, yeah.
until the doctor came in and scared her straight and was like, this is a horrible way to die. Like if and you're choosing it for yourself because you're like you don't want to be in this state. And so when he scared her, she healed in like 3 weeks.
So you should take it seriously.
Yeah, because she started to take it seriously. So I
Yeah.
think, that just kind of shows that like that emotional component that I feel is kind of different from a dementia flavor of being more emotional, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like she was being maybe combative out of protest, right? Being difficult, but it sounds like it was out of character, sort of being difficult, right?
And I think that happens to us during RSD, right? I think it
Yeah.
was a little bit of RSD from the sense that, like, well, he's just gonna leave me here to die. We also come to find out that the facility was an hour away from his home. He was driving he's a teacher, he was driving after school every single day and visiting her every single, like, he did not abandon her.
Right.
But it felt like that perceived rejection. That's the thing. RSD can be a little bit illogical because we feel that overwhelming sense of rejection. And if you guys haven't checked it out, one of our most popular episodes is the explanation of what's actually happening in your brain during an RSD episode. So that one was really cool. TLDR for I think it was like an hour and a half long episode. Your prefrontal cortex is shutting off. And so the logic goes away. And it's different than like anxiety and stuff, because with anxiety, you can still be logical. The prefrontal cortex is online. For us, it is just completely offline. And so with RSD, that does become sometimes not so logical.
Yeah. But you can write it out, but it's like it sucks. But there are things you can do to get through it,
Yeah.
even if it
And we
is
talk
just
about that in the episode. We talk about what
yeah.
you can do.
So your grandmother's sister, did she have a diagnosis of any kind?
No, that generation,
Yeah,
and she's a woman, right? I don't think they ever would have. Like, even it's hard.
totally.
That's what's so scary about some of this stuff with dementia is they just had no shot at ever being diagnosed. And when it's a diagnosis that relies on history, right? Because there's no such thing as spontaneous ADHD or spontaneous autism. If it truly, like, honestly, really, truly came out of nowhere, that's something different.
Yeah.
But sometimes it can seem like it came out of nowhere, and it's actually that your ability to mask went away. So that's what makes it hard.
Well, I think even generationally, the reason to get diagnosed and the things that it interferes with are different, just of how things have evolved and changed, right? Like there might be, I think, because of just awareness, research, stigma, when like when my parents and even my grandparents were growing up, the world looked different. And so because it looked different, that
Autism level 1 and stuff like that did not exist.
right. And so the reason to get diagnosed maybe didn't exist, or because the world was different, you could cope and manage in different ways. The reason to get diagnosed, there's a lot of great reasons to get diagnosed, right? And a lot of different ways you can get support. For me, later in life, it was because it was interfering with work, my desk job. I have a creative job, and I'm drawn to a creative job as a designer because I think a lot of those are ADHD. I think works for that sort of thing.
When you look at creative teams in like tech jobs and stuff, everyone has
Yeah.
ADHD.
Totally right, right. And so, but the other symptoms were getting in the way to the point where I needed a diagnosis to get medication, and that helped me do a sit down in front of a computer job, right? No, my grandmother grew up in like the 20s and 30s, right? And so I guess she was maybe born in the 20s, grew up in the 30s and 40s. So she lived on a farm in rural middle America. And so when you're on a farm, without she would tell me stories about life before indoor toilets. She told me stories about getting electricity for the first time. So the world is different, and you're able to stay present, stay busy in ways that your ADHD side of things are going to look totally different. My grandfather, um, he went into the military like at a very young age. He like left home, lied about his age, got into the military, and that became a huge structure part of his life. And I think a lot of people, and it for my grandfather, I think it gave him a sense of structure. And I think a lot of people who go into the military with ADHD, like this, that structure gives them a way to manage it. But then, like,
Very much so.
yeah,
The military is famous for their lack of structure. No.
yeah, and I think that had something to do with my grandfather's parenting style on my dad, and my dad's ability to like have structure, which again like impacted the way I was raised, which was like without structure. I think a complete reaction to that, which is I think hilarious. But my grandmother, on the other hand, she was like living on a farm, working on a farm, so like moving with the day. Like there was things to do, things that needed to get done. But I remember like when she was telling me stories, oftentimes, and I remember this even when I was a kid, she would like little things. She would forget little things, or like oftentimes she would gender swap when she was telling stories. Her characters in the story are like family members. It's like she would oftentimes just use he and she interchangeably. Um, for whatever reason, it was. I don't think it was intentional. It was just the way her brain was categorizing things, and she would oftentimes be forgetful of people's names, and then later, later in life, in her later years, um, she would, we'd all be hanging out, and my grandmother was. It was impressive because I remember she was sharp for a long time, and I just remember like hanging out with her, like talking to her, and she was, like uh, she was funny, and like she read constantly, and like she would tell stories, and it never seemed like she was having signs um of dementia or necessarily forgetfulness. But I do think she had an amount of anxiety because she got to a point where she just didn't leave the house. So we'd go visit her, and again, like visiting her, she was sharp for a long time. But then after a while, she would start like repeating herself or telling the same story over and over again within a short span. Honestly, seeing her and like spending time with her, I think it was more likely that it was ADHD, maybe anxiety, maybe even autism, right? It was just completely missed because of her generation, because of the way she was raised, because of like the era she grew up in. Because it never simply like when we were talking about dementia, some of the more like severe side of it, she never really had that. It was just more like that forgetfulness and just the memory stuff, which again to me just at the time it was all she would repeat herself. We all kind of laugh about it, but like reflecting on it, like that's probably just an aging mind with ADHD because she was sharp in a lot of other areas.
Oh, the staying in the house. Yeah, everyone in my family on my mom's side has had that exact same thing happen when they hit a certain age. They just do not want to go out. My grandma, it got so bad she didn't want to go to a nursing home, right? But she did have dementia, but she fell a number of times. Oh my God, this is also, she had high blood pressure and her doctor said cut back on salt. Well, her being presumably a little autistic took that to mean no salt. And so she systematically cut all sodium out of her diet. All she would eat is lettuce leaves, olive oil, and no sodium cans of like green beans and stuff. And so at a certain point, she fell in like a mall and hit her head
Hmm.
a couple times, got concussion. Concussion, of course, will very much increase risk of dementia for anyone. We go to the doctor and he's like, I've literally never seen this in my entire career. She has no sodium in her body because she took those instructions so literally, and you need sodium for your heart to pump and for you to
Wow.
survive. So she had dementia, but that I don't think was, and that's where when I compare her with her sister, I'm like, these were really different because I remember when she started to get like aggressive and stuff like that, and it was just so different than the ADHD, RSD emotions. You know what I mean? It's aggression over things that make no sense. And that's why I wanted to point out with RSD, it's like, well, you can logic your way why this person is reacting that way. But hers was an independent risk factor, not genetic. So, but she didn't want to let anybody in her house to take care of her. She holed herself up. Everyone in the family has kind of holed up and doesn't want to come out. when they hit a particular age. And I do think that's an autistic trait. And that is something in the limited amount of stuff I could find about aging with autism. It's a little hard to make sense of what they meant by it, but they said that autistic people are less likely to go out and actually do activities. And so that social isolation piece is twofold. It's both, having trouble connecting with people, but also us not putting ourselves out there to connect in the first place. And so I do think that that is an element of aging with autism. And so to give another example of that, with my grandma's sister when she was in this nursing home temporarily. And it was also not like a depressing nursing home. It was like other people who, had injuries and were trying to recover. They were all very sharp, right? Like it wasn't, um, you know, she refused to meet or socialize with any of the other residents. And we do think part of that
Wow.
was because she felt like if she made friends, she would be forced to stay there.
Yeah, so, like, from her perspective, like, it's scary because she's at a certain age where she doesn't wanna lose her independence and get
Yeah.
abandoned. There's also one of the biggest things with ADHD and autism, first of all, is stimulation, just like the increased rate of, like, overwhelm and overstimulation, and then transitions, right? The thing we all come share in common is, like, we struggle with transitions, so much of it is, like, having tactics and tools to help with transitions. That's a big transition, right? Losing your independence,
Yeah.
going to a nursing home, not sure if you're gonna come back.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and so she created her own structure, if you call it that. They had a big, beautiful dining room 'cause she lives in California, right? So they've got beautiful garden, sunny weather and stuff. But she would sit at the same table at the same chair for every meal. And if someone else was sitting at the table, she would just turn around and go back to her room and skip that meal
Yeah.
while she was there. Uh, so that was interesting. But when she first got checked in, they did a screening and they said that it was cognitive decline because on the first day, she could not tell the time. She couldn't remember anything. She didn't know what day it was. But then I flew out there and visited her a couple weeks later, especially after the doctor scared her straight and she had done a couple weeks of rehab and she was like walking again. I'm like honestly jealous because like I've been in physical therapy for so long for hypermobility and it's like I make no progress. And then, she fixes a broken leg in 3 weeks, but whatever. Good for her. But I go to visit, she's walking again, right? She's doing great. But she had amazing recall for both short-term and long-term events. Because with dementia, sometimes what happens is you get this flood of sort of longer term memories. Like they'll be able to tell stories about their childhood with like incredibly vivid detail because it's like dumping into the short term memories, my understanding. With her, but then they would have that like universal forgetfulness of the short term events. But with her, she both was telling stories from her childhood, but also was able to like, they had a little fireplace at this facility. I don't know why in California. I think it was for aesthetics, but um, but we sat next to the fireplace and had like a smoothie. And then an hour later, we were up on the balcony and she looked over and said, "Oh, that guy is sitting at the fireplace. He moved the pillows from where we were sitting." Right. And so I'm like, okay, that's very good recall.
Yeah.
You remember both that we were at the fireplace, where the pillows were, stuff like that. So she had no discernible memory issues as far as I could tell. And what bothered me about this screening is, they sort of diagnosed her with mild cognitive decline. They didn't screen for depression. They didn't screen for ADHD. I mean, that'd be way too much to ask, right? But they didn't even screen for depression for someone who doesn't want to be there. And so it's
Yeah.
like, of course, you're going to potentially be so depressed you don't know what day it is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or wanna move around very much or, like, wanna meet people, all of that. Yeah. Well, and I think too, like, I've heard stories of people with dementia or people have had family members where they'll forget people exist or they'll think somebody is somebody else, like, think
Hmm.
that's who they are, which is different than, like, my grandmother, she would oftentimes, like, call us by different names, call us by the wrong name, but not because she thought we were somebody else. It's just, like, you get mixed up, like,
Right.
when you have kids, I'll do it with my kids, just sometimes call them by the wrong name is how your brain categorizes things. You know what you're doing, which is different than thinking somebody is a different person altogether, or asking about somebody who has been gone for a long time or grown up or something, which is very, very different.
It's almost like a superficial memory issue as opposed to like a deep memory issue, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thing that was interesting too is her son thinks that she's going deaf, but what I noticed when I was in that facility, because it was just kind of a unique opportunity to see her in different environments, she could hear just fine in her quiet room, but she struggled in the common areas with other people.
Mm,
And so I think that it is auditory processing disorder, which I also have, where she can't filter out the external noises. And so if you think about someone who's going deaf, that would be like the volume on their TV is if their brain was a TV is turned very, very low. Whereas someone with auditory processing disorder, the volume is normal, but there's also a bunch of other TVs right next to it playing at the exact same volume. And so then you just are like, I can't even discern like what's happening on any of these because it's just too many different noises.
well, speaking of genetics and ADHD rates and autism rates, I'm curious, what were you able to find about the rates of ADHD and autism and like aging adults? I mean, you'd assume it's similar to children, right?
You would assume that. That would make sense because it's fully genetic. But actually, what I found is that if you were to sample, and also it's a myth that you can outgrow these conditions, right? Like they're lifelong.
Yeah, of
But
course.
when you take a sample of the population age 65 and up, ADHD rates are significantly lower. Do you have a guess for why that's the case?
I'm just guessing it's underdiagnosed, right? Like kind of calling back to what we were talking about earlier with the uh, the different era, the different generations, and awareness of it.
Yeah, that one's a really good guess. Unfortunately, the answer is even more sad. It shortens your lifespan. It's by 8 years if you're only inattentive, and it's by 13 years if you're combined. And so for Americans, life expectancy is 78 years old. So, wait, is that right? Yeah, 78 years old. So for Americans, for like particularly inattentive type, that puts your life expectancy right at 65. And so the rates are actually lower in 65 and up because a lot of people don't make it there,
There's
which is
fewer of us.
super sad.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason for that is also not biological. Like it's not like ADHD or autism in and of themselves are these like ticking time bombs that are going to like, it's not like a Huntington's disease type of thing where it's going to kill you. It's mostly it's a combo of things. It's, we tend to take on bad habits like smoking, eating junk food, lack of exercise. And so over a lifetime, those can kind of accrue and increase risk factors. Sadly, a really big one is car accidents and just general accidental injury. Like we've
It's the
done
impulsivity side of it,
it's the
right?
impulsivity. That's why impulsivity has a bigger impact on lifespan than inattentive alone. Lack of sleep. This one's a little scary for me. That one can actually cause dementia because your brain, they've found when it's in deep, deep sleep, actually detoxes. Like it gets rid of toxins when you're in that deep sleep state. And so a lot of us have trouble hitting deep sleep. If you take a bunch of naps, you don't hit that phase.
Mm,
A lot of us just don't sleep enough in general. Chronic stress, and then unfortunately, suicidality is a really big problem in our community as well. And so when you take all those factors together, it's not a single thing, but it just our lives are a little bit more challenging. But the good news is that ADHD meds, like particularly stimulants, entirely cancel out that lifespan difference. So if you consistently take stimulants, then you will have the same life expectancy as someone without ADHD.
yeah, that's awesome. I mean, hearing you talk through it totally tracks, right? All of those, like, it's like, who doesn't struggle with sleep? It's tough. It's like sleep is the
Neurotypicals.
yeah. I
Neurotypicals
guess
don't.
yeah. I guess, but it sucks because it's like sleep and exercise are like two of the best things you can do when you have ADHD. But there's like sometimes some of the hardest to attain, right? And the good news is hearing you talk to it too. Medication helps, obviously, but then a lot of that stuff is truly preventable. A lot of it
That's
is
the silver lining to me, because we're not sitting here telling you guys like, hey, this is a ticking time bomb, like it will cause cancer or something like that, right? Like we at least have agency, and it's also never too late.
uh obviously stimulants are helpful. If they're helpful and somebody's like missed a diagnosis and we can see the impact it has, and we could get older people on stimulants, what's the path for that?
You'd hope so. But as with everything, it's just not that easy. So stimulants are not FDA approved over the age of 65. And actually Vyvanse, which is lisdexamfetamine, I believe, for non-US listeners, it's only approved up to age 55 in the United States.
Hold on. It's only approved like if they stop proving it at a certain age.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean people over that age cannot get it, or does that mean like if am I still like?
Functionally, yes. Functionally, yes. It's really hard to get over the age of 65
But what if
or
you've
55.
been taking it though?
A
You still
lot
get
of
it?
shitty doctors will just stop prescribing it to you once you hit 65.
I need to hear more about this. Let me know in the comments. If you are aging or know somebody's aging, what's your access to stimulant medication like in your area? I'm really curious about this. Let's start a discussion in the comments about it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is, in the US in particular, it also becomes harder to get insurance coverage, and it gets a lot harder to get Medicare or Medicaid to cover it if your doctor is willing to prescribe it what's called off label, because to prescribe things, they, again, in the US, and it's a similar process in other countries, they need FDA approval. And if you are prescribing something not for an FDA approved intended purpose, that's what's called off label. And so that's where it gets harder to cover the cost. But I want to be abundantly clear here. It's not that it's not approved because it's been shown to be dangerous. I want to restate that so I'm very clear. We don't have evidence that it's super dangerous. It's not approved because we don't have evidence. Period. End of sentence. They intentionally exclude people over the age of 65 in nearly all ADHD studies because
Wow.
they believe that people over that age with their additional health conditions and with their additional medications, because typically over the age of 65, you tend to be taking more meds like blood pressure meds or things like that, would create confounding variables in their research. And so they have systematically excluded this age group and therefore lack the evidence to be able to certify that it's safe. It's fantastic. So, to get into the confounding variable stuff too, this is what really pisses me off is that a confounding variable happens when you're trying to prove that one action can predictably cause a certain outcome. The confounding variable would either falsely make it look like A causes B when that actually isn't the case, or that A does not cause B even though it does, but it was like another variable in the mix, right? So when we talked about our Tylenol episode, the one that I think we called it what actually causes autism. They wanted to prove that Tylenol causes autism. The confounding variable in their study methodology was that autistic mothers experience more pain, and they did not account for that in the American studies. They did rule that out as a confounding variable in the Sweden studies, where they did not show a causal relationship because they factored in siblings. Now, with our medication, so you can sometimes also deal with confounding variables by adding size, like so just doing a bigger study, and that would absolutely help with the medication example that we're giving here. Because if you get enough older people in a study, they're not all going to have the same comorbid health conditions, and they're not all going to be on the same additional medications. And so if your sample size was big enough, you've now reduced the chance that one particular confounding variable would influence the study. Like, let's say, this is completely made up. Let's say stimulants reacted with a medication called blah, blah, blah. And blah, blah, blah is a common heart, like blood pressure medication.
Mm-hmm.
If you get enough people that aren't on blah, 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 then you wouldn't have that confounding variable. Now,
Yeah.
size would not have helped the Tylenol study because their study methodology, the study setup was fundamentally flawed. In that case, it's like if you showed 100 people versus 10,000 people who were all colorblind a picture of a rose and asked them to describe the color, you wouldn't get more accuracy with size. So it's not like size always fixes the problem when the study setup is fundamentally flawed because they weren't accounting for just increased pain in parents of autistic kids. But in our case, in the case of getting stimulants approved for age 65 and up, size absolutely would fix that in these studies. They just don't do it.
Yeah, so it's just a completely missing data point. It's completely excluded.
Yeah. Ironically, it is not uncommon in geriatric medicine to prescribe stimulants to very old non ADHD patients to essentially wake up the brain. So they're comfortable doing it for people who are like, late 80s, early 90s, very frail, just to get their brain going again.
Interesting.
But they
So
aren't
interesting.
comfortable doing it with someone who's age 65, completely healthy, and has ADHD.
Yeah, it's a flawed system. It sounds like it just sounds like they weren't considering the entire population when making these rules, as if it was designed to only help a certain demographic.
We've never heard that before. Okay. So the next section was who actually gets studied because there's even more shit with how they design the study. So if you wanted
Okay.
to.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so they're completely excluded from those studies. So who's getting the attention? Like who's actually getting a study? Like where is it going?
Yeah. So the overwhelming bulk of funding for ADHD studies and autism studies is going towards researching child ADHD and autism, which is why there's such a prevalent sort of misconception that it's like a childhood disorder. Because that's what a lot of the studies are looking at is how it manifests in kids, which drives me nuts because you'll find stuff like, children with ADHD have a magnesium deficiency. And I'm like, should I be taking magnesium? Yeah, and it's like, if so, how much? That's a really
Yeah.
important vitamin for your body to have. So even within that, there's a lot of other crap with who actually gets studied. So randomized controlled trials are like the gold standard for evaluating the safety and efficacy of medications. The randomized controlled trials have very strict criteria around who gets to participate. They exclude anyone with a psychiatric or neurodevelopmental comorbidity. So anyone who has, if you're studying ADHD medication, depression, autism, psychosis, intellectual disability, or other medical conditions such as cardiovascular disease. So,
All of these very common things that we also have. So how are you getting any data on the occurrence of these things along with ADHD and autism?
so this is only randomized controlled trial. So this is only looking
Yeah.
at do the meds work? Other studies that are looking at just like rates of occurrence would obviously include those people. But in terms of determining, hey, do these meds work? Oh, you have ADHD and depression. We're not going to study you, uh, which is like everyone. So there was a study that was looking at the exclusion criteria, and they determined that only 31% of the population of ADHDers would ever be allowed to participate in an ADHD medication study because of the way they set up this exclusion criteria. And so the other 2/3 of us who have any sort of comorbidity at all are completely in the dark, and we might face side effects that go undetected because if you're a person who has, call it ADHD, and you're diabetic, and the medication somehow interacts with that, you would not be allowed to be part of that randomized controlled trial. They might do other specific types of trials, specifically looking at someone with ADHD and diabetes, but that would not then be a randomized controlled trial, which is considered gold standard. So yeah, there are a lot of gaps in the way that we research meds.
Yeah. So it's sounds like it's in our hands to advocate for ourselves and our loved ones.
Yeah. And it also, to that point, this sort of spotty data can sometimes make doctors feel overly cautious, right? So kind of a main takeaway here is like if you have a doctor that suspects cognitive decline, you very much need to forcefully insist that they screen for ADHD and autism in the first place, or even like we talked about earlier, UTI, liver damage, medication interactions, those can also cause those symptoms. And if you think that a stimulant might be like a good solution to the problem, you might need to be very forceful with the doctor in order for them to prescribe it off label, because the doctor might have misconceptions about it being unsafe because in the US it's not FDA approved. I don't think they're like more available in any other country. Like the US is the most readily available to get stimulants, right? So I think what I'm saying here is pretty globally applicable. You might need to be very forceful with that doctor and just know that it's not that we have this like trove of knowledge that they're super dangerous. We just lack knowledge. But again, the side effects that we were talking about earlier with dementia medications are like severe.
Significantly, yeah, potentially worse. And this is where it's going to be, you're going to have to talk to your doctor, and advocacy and persistence might play a role here, right? So being able to
Oh my
help,
gosh, yeah.
yeah, being able to be persistent with what you need in your healthcare, or helping your loved ones be persistent, helping them get what they need. And speaking of advocacy, like, coaching is still beneficial even later in
Totally.
life.
Absolutely, yeah. That's one, Kathleen Nadeau, who was the one who, I feel like I've said her name wrong this entire podcast. She was one of the ones who was actually looking into, creating a criteria for determining if you have ADHD, age 65 and up. And she's really a big fan of coaching because, in particular, older people who did not ever get support or diagnosis or anything tend to have built up a lot of maladaptive coping mechanisms, and then as their ability to mask diminishes with age, you're kind of left with this really unstable structure. Like it's like building a house of toothpicks and then there's a hurricane. What are you left with, right? And so helping folks in that age range basically like establish better habits that work more with their brain as opposed to just whatever they sort of scrounged by and developed in the last number of decades is going to be really, really important. It's absolutely not too late for coaching. It's actually a really good time. Any time's a good time to help
Yeah.
work on that stuff.
Well, and also just with the help with developing systems, having support, having some advocacy, um, accountability. All these things are going to be super helpful, especially if like the family situation is tricky, right? Because like you want to intervene, but sometimes it's tough for a lot of reasons, and so getting coaching support can help, so it doesn't have to all be on just the family to do everything.
Yeah. Oh, family situation too. I think I forgot to say this earlier. My grandma's sister got out of the nursing home and she's happy and healthy and fine now. So I just wanted to
Good.
close up the loose end on that story. She's doing great. And then the last thing too, and we talked about this earlier, but just to reiterate is do everything possible to help reduce social isolation. Like we said, it's a huge risk factor for other health issues, but you have to be smart about the way that you do it. You can't just go out there and be like, make new friends. That's really hard.
Yeah.
So, your best approaches are going to include structure and really minimize the effort it takes to initiate social contact. So, Kathleen, again, in her talk, which we'll have linked in the resources section, is a big fan of retirement communities because you have an event coordinator who is putting all these together and all you have to do is show up. So that's a really big deal to lower the sort of barrier of effort to getting out into a social event
Yeah, that's awesome.
and making friends and stuff like that. Another way they talked about is getting a part-time job. A lot of us hate our jobs, let's be honest, and are so excited to retire. But what happens is we tend to think that these work friends are going to be lifelong friends. And I don't think it's untrue. I don't think they like secretly hated us. It's just when you aren't seeing people every day, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And so typically those work friendships tend to deteriorate after retirement. And, if that was your sort of social network, which work is a really easy way to fall back on. You are forced to show up every day and interact with these people. So naturally, you're going to probably make some friends. That's a bit of a cultural thing. I know in Europe, there are some countries where you're less likely to have work friends, but it might happen. But that's not a good thing to lean on when you retire, right? And it also created a sense of structure. And so when that is gone, your life can actually kind of feel like it's in shambles when you take all that away. So there are a fair number of people who ultimately get like a fun part-time job, something that actually is in your passion area that doesn't necessarily make a lot of money is a really good option to kind of add in a little bit more structure, social.
Yeah, well, and to add to that, I think like the we know that community helps. We know that being social helps, but that doesn't mean you have to have a consistent, long-term established community and lifelong friends. It just you can have seasonal friends, seasonal social environment, social activities, and this is where I think going back to the retirement community, that makes a lot of sense, and which is different than a nursing home. They think they're losing their independence. When a retirement community, you can keep your independence, and it just builds in that social aspect of it. And so I'm saying that because it can be hard to make and keep friends when you have ADHD and autism, but knowing how to navigate and make friends even seasonally, it's being social that's the component. And it actually, I mean, not to say it helps having long-term friends and people that know you, right? But people come and go, right? So I think we don't have to be tied to that level of commitment can feel overwhelming. Whereas like it's fun to be social just in general, and building and developing, holding on to that skill is different than trying to hold on to lifelong relationships when sometimes those can be challenging.
Kind of interesting anecdote from Kathleen's research as well. She found a lot of ADHDers that were older were on their second marriage, and their first marriage was horrendous. They married young, married the wrong person, married impulsively. But then she found that a lot of them had a second partner that they met at some point later in life who was like very supportive. And so she said that that was just kind of an uplifting thing to see that we kind of learned from our mistakes from like the first marriage, and that it is never too late even to have a supportive spouse, because when she was researching these people, a lot of them had super supportive, kind, helpful, understanding spouses who were a second marriage. So even this is so dark, but even partners can be seasonal. This is our
Well,
very
that's
happy holiday episode, you guys.
yeah. I mean, yeah. I don't see that as dark. I think that it's companionship, right? And you can have somebody that you can get to know, and it's the thing. Like it goes back to that. We seek each other out with ADHD, and you can form deep bonds very quickly. And so I think it's easy to get to feel like you know somebody really well, and have that companionship, and that can change throughout time. And that's I think the kind of stuff is normal. So if you've listened to this far, thank you. Hopefully we shared something that's helpful or relatable. Like, subscribe. Let us know in the comments. Yeah, how are you thinking about approaching the holiday season with your family, and do you have other people in your life that you've noticed that have had a good example? I want to hear like people aging well. Who's had a good example of aging well?
Sorry for the really depressing holiday episode, you guys, but the silver lining is we have agency. We can control our own fate. I hope this didn't make you too sad.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't see it as sad. I think like there's an optimism to it. There's a hope. There's optimism to it, which is like, we're gonna have memory issues. It doesn't mean we're all gonna have dementia. Some of us might. But there are preventative things we can do, and there is communities we can build, and there's things we can do so that we can continue to live really rich, full lives all the way into old age. And that to me is like optimistic. It's like there's things to look forward to.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and thanks for listening.